Before she became Marilyn Monroe, she was already disappearing. Long before the platinum hair, the red lipstick, and the carefully rehearsed smile, there was a girl who learned early that identity could be taken away. Born as Norma Jeane Mortensen, she entered the world without stability, without protection, and without permanence. From the beginning, she was passed from place to place, never staying long enough to feel safe. This pattern would define her entire life. The world would later see a woman adored by millions, but few would understand that she was shaped first by abandonment. Hollywood did not create Marilyn Monroe from nothing, it found a fracture and widened it. Norma Jeane grew up in foster homes and institutions, surrounded by uncertainty. Her mother struggled with severe mental illness and was eventually institutionalized. Her father was absent, his identity unclear. This left Norma Jeane with no emotional anchor. Psychologists later noted that such early instability often results in an intense need for approval and affection. In Norma Jeane's case, that need would be exploited on a global scale. By her teenage years, she learned that attention brought safety. Being desired meant being noticed. Being noticed meant being protected. When she married young, it was not romance that motivated her but survival. When that marriage ended, she found herself alone again, searching for a place to belong. That search led her directly into the machinery of Hollywood. The film industry did not ask who Norma Jeane was, it asked what she could become. Studio executives saw potential but not complexity. They saw a body that could be marketed, a face that could be molded, and a personality that could be simplified. Norma Jeane was encouraged to bleach her hair, change her voice, alter her posture, and erase her past. The transformation was not gradual, it was systematic. With each adjustment, Norma Jeane became less visible. Marilyn Monroe was designed to replace her. This was not empowerment, it was extraction. The new identity worked. Marilyn Monroe quickly became a sensation. Audiences responded to her presence with fascination and desire. She was framed as naive, playful, and sexually available, yet emotionally shallow. This image sold tickets. It also trapped her. Every role reinforced the same stereotype. Every appearance tightened the boundaries around who she was allowed to be. Behind the scenes, Marilyn was studying acting seriously. She read literature, philosophy, and psychology. She challenged directors and sought emotional depth in her performances, but this side of her was inconvenient. Intelligence disrupted the fantasy. Vulnerability complicated the product. Hollywood preferred Marilyn silent. As her fame grew, the contradiction intensified. The public adored the image, the studios controlled it, and the woman inside struggled to survive beneath it. Marilyn was praised for being effortless, yet punished when she failed to perform that effortlessness on demand. Any deviation from the persona was labeled as instability. This label would follow her for the rest of her life. Insomnia became constant, anxiety increased. She turned to medication not for pleasure but for rest. The same industry that demanded perfection also supplied the substances that numbed her. Doctors prescribed freely. Accountability was absent. Her dependency was treated as a flaw, not as a consequence. The more Marilyn struggled, the more the narrative hardened. She was difficult, she was unreliable, she was fragile. These words erased context. They ignored the pressure of being a symbol instead of a human being. They dismissed the cost of living inside a mask that could never be removed. Yet Marilyn continued to work. She formed her own production company in an attempt to gain control. This was nearly unheard of for an actress at the time. It was a quiet rebellion against the system that confined her, but rebellion has consequences. Hollywood does not tolerate unpredictability, especially from those it believes it owns. As the years passed, Marilyn's body became public property. Her image was dissected, exaggerated, and consumed. Her privacy vanished. Her emotional needs were minimized. She was expected to remain desirable, grateful, and compliant. Any sign of exhaustion was framed as weakness. Internally, the conflict was unbearable. Norma Jeane still existed, searching for stability, meaning, and love. Marilyn Monroe demanded constant performance. The distance between them grew wider with each passing year. This internal split is critical to understanding what happened later. Marilyn Monroe was not simply a victim of fame. She was the result of a system that prioritizes illusion over truth, a system that rewards visibility while punishing authenticity. By the early 1960s, the woman behind the image was exhausted, not just physically but psychologically. She had spent her entire life trying to become what others wanted, believing that doing so would finally make her safe. It never did. And as the image grew more powerful, the woman became more alone. Because in Hollywood, once the illusion begins to crack, the response is not compassion, it is replacement. And that is where Marilyn Monroe's story begins to turn from tragedy into something far more dangerous. Hollywood's most effective weapon against Marilyn Monroe was not exploitation alone, it was simplification. The industry did not just sell her image, it reduced her humanity until the image was all that remained. The dumb blonde persona was not an accident, nor was it a misunderstanding. It was a carefully maintained construct designed to keep Marilyn predictable, controllable, and replaceable. From the earliest stages of her stardom, Marilyn was encouraged to perform ignorance. Interviews emphasized breathy delivery and playful confusion. Publicity photos exaggerated vulnerability and sexual innocence. Scripts reinforced the same limited archetype. The more she embodied this role, the more successful she became. But success came at a cost. Every performance of foolishness undermined her credibility as a serious artist, and more importantly, as a serious person. This erosion was gradual but relentless. Marilyn was acutely aware of the contradiction. She understood that the public image paid her bills while simultaneously destroying her autonomy. When she attempted to assert intellectual depth, she was dismissed. When she challenged directors, she was labeled difficult. When she demanded better scripts, she was accused of arrogance. The system rewarded compliance and punished self-awareness. The media played a central role in this process. Headlines rarely focused on her work. They fixated on her body, her marriages, her emotional state. Each misstep was amplified. Each vulnerability became spectacle. The press did not merely report her instability, it constructed it. This construction followed a familiar pattern. Marilyn was portrayed as unreliable, late, emotionally fragile. Context was omitted. The exhaustion of endless retakes, the anxiety of being scrutinized, and the pressure of carrying entire productions were rarely acknowledged. Male co-stars exhibiting similar behavior were framed as passionate or eccentric. Marilyn was framed as a problem. Over time, this narrative hardened into accepted truth. Studios responded by tightening control. Contracts became more restrictive. Creative input was limited. Surveillance increased. Marilyn's movements, relationships, and habits were monitored not for her well-being, but for risk management. She was an asset whose value depended on predictability. Any deviation threatened profitability. At the same time, Marilyn pursued education in private. She studied acting seriously, trained with respected coaches, and immersed herself in literature. She surrounded herself with writers, thinkers, and intellectuals. This side of her was intentionally hidden from the public. Intelligence contradicted the fantasy. Complexity disrupted consumption. The more Marilyn grew internally, the more the industry resisted. This resistance manifested as isolation. Invitations slowed, roles diminished, studios hesitated to invest, whispers circulated about her mental health. These whispers became self-fulfilling, anxiety increased, insomnia worsened, medication use escalated. Each symptom was then used as evidence to justify further marginalization. It was a closed loop. What is often misunderstood is that Marilyn's struggles were not signs of weakness. They were rational responses to an environment that demanded emotional exposure without emotional support. She was expected to be endlessly available, endlessly desirable, and endlessly compliant. There was no space for rest, boundaries, or authenticity. Her attempts to escape this cycle were met with resistance. When she formed her own production company, it was framed as ambition beyond her capacity. When she sought more serious roles, she was accused of misunderstanding her place. When she expressed frustration, it was labeled hysteria. Language mattered. Words like fragile, unstable, and unreliable replaced words like exhausted, exploited, and overwhelmed. By the late 1950s, Marilyn's public image had become a prison. She could not evolve without risking rejection. She could not retreat without being punished. The persona that had made her famous now prevented her survival. The gap between who she was and who she was expected to be widened into psychological fracture. This fracture is essential to understanding her final years. As Hollywood's tolerance waned, Marilyn's sense of self deteriorated. Norma Jeane resurfaced not as a memory but as a need. She sought safety, intimacy, and meaning. Relationships became intense. Abandonment fears resurfaced. Each rejection reinforced the belief that love was conditional. The industry responded with distance. When Marilyn struggled on set, patience evaporated. When she needed reassurance, it was withheld. When she failed to meet expectations, she was replaced. Hollywood does not nurture agging myths, it discards them quietly. Behind closed doors, Marilyn was increasingly aware of her disposability. She spoke openly about feeling used and forgotten. This awareness did not make her suicidal by default. It made her anxious, hypervigilant, and desperate for stability. These emotional states were later retroactively framed as proof of self-destruction. But context matters. Marilyn Monroe did not unravel in isolation. She unraveled inside a system designed to extract value until depletion. The same studios that celebrated her image distanced themselves from her humanity. The same media that profited from her vulnerability ridiculed her pain. This systemic failure is often reduced to personal tragedy. That reduction is convenient, it absolves the machine. As Marilyn entered the early 1960s, her professional identity weakened while her symbolic value remained high. She was still famous but increasingly unsupported, still desired but no longer protected, still watched but no longer guided. This imbalance is dangerous. When a person is elevated as an icon but denied as a human, collapse becomes likely, not inevitable but probable. Marilyn was not simply falling apart, she was being dismantled. And as the illusion cracked, those who once benefited from it began to step away. Because when Hollywood can no longer control the image, it chooses to control the narrative. And that narrative would soon redefine Marilyn Monroe, not as a woman who was broken by a system, but as a system-proof explanation for her own disappearance. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was no longer collapsing in public. She was disappearing quietly. The chaos that once followed her had slowed, not because stability had returned, but because exhaustion had replaced resistance. The system around her interpreted this silence as recovery. In reality, it was withdrawal. This distinction would prove fatal. Hollywood continued to treat Marilyn as a liability rather than a patient. Her emotional fragility was framed as unprofessionalism. Her need for structure was seen as weakness. The same industry that had molded her into an icon now viewed her humanity as an inconvenience. Compassion had a cost. Replacement was cheaper. At this stage, Marilyn's psychological state was not defined by hopelessness, but by ambivalence. She oscillated between belief in renewal and fear of erasure. She spoke of future projects. She made plans. She reorganized her home. These behaviors contradict the simplified image of a woman preparing for death. They reveal someone attempting to regain control in a life that had become increasingly dictated by others. But beneath this surface effort, the internal conflict intensified. The division between Norma Jeane and Marilyn Monroe had become more pronounced with age. Youth had once masked the strain of performance. Now the performance demanded more energy than she could sustain. The mask required constant maintenance. Any crack was amplified, photographed, and redistributed. Medication remained central to her daily existence. It was not recreational, it was functional. Prescribed by multiple doctors, often without coordination, it became the primary method of emotional regulation. Sleep depended on it. Anxiety receded briefly under its influence, but clarity suffered, judgment blurred, physical resilience declined, dependency deepened. This dependency did not emerge in isolation. It developed in an environment where rest was penalized and vulnerability was monetized. Marilyn was encouraged to work through distress rather than recover from it. Each attempt to pause was interpreted as instability. Each refusal to perform was treated as betrayal. As her career prospects narrowed, her symbolic value expanded. She was still Marilyn Monroe, still an image that could be sold. Referenced and exploited, posters, magazines, and retrospectives continued to circulate her likeness, detached entirely from her present condition. The illusion thrived independently of the woman. This dissonance produced profound psychological strain. To be constantly visible while internally deteriorating creates a sense of unreality. Marilyn existed everywhere as an image but nowhere as a protected individual. This fragmentation intensified feelings of isolation. She was admired but not supported, desired but not safeguarded. Re-hook, and this is where the story takes a darker turn. In her final weeks, Marilyn's relationships grew increasingly transactional. Trust eroded. Advisors, doctors, and acquaintances blurred professional boundaries. Decisions were made on her behalf, often without transparency. Autonomy diminished. Surveillance increased. She was no longer treated as a person capable of self-direction, but as a variable to be managed. This environment fostered paranoia, but not without cause. Marilyn was aware that conversations were monitored. She suspected that her associations carried political implications. Whether these fears were fully justified is less important than the fact that they were reinforced by real events. She was being watched. Files existed. Attention from powerful institutions was not imagined. Yet these elements were excluded from the dominant narrative that followed her death. When Marilyn Monroe was found dead on August 5, 1962, the official explanation arrived quickly. Too quickly. The conclusion of probable suicide aligned perfectly with the image already assigned to her. A fragile woman, a troubled star, a tragic ending. The story required no additional investigation because it confirmed what the public already believed. But belief is not evidence. The circumstances surrounding her death raised immediate questions. Timelines conflicted. Procedures deviated from protocol. Witness statements shifted. Physical evidence was incomplete. These inconsistencies did not prove murder, but they demanded scrutiny. That scrutiny never fully occurred. Instead, the narrative solidified. Marilyn's vulnerability became the cause rather than the context. Her medication use became the explanation rather than the symptom. Her loneliness became destiny rather than consequence. This reframing absolved the system entirely. If Marilyn destroyed herself, no one else was responsible. Re-hook, but that assumption depends on a dangerous simplification. Suicide is often misunderstood as a single decision rather than a process shaped by environment, access, and intervention. Even if Marilyn's death resulted from an overdose, the conditions that made such an outcome possible were constructed over years. Fragmented medical care, emotional isolation, professional abandonment, media hostility, institutional neglect. These factors did not disappear when her heart stopped. They were simply no longer examined. In death, Marilyn became easier to manage. The living woman required resources, patience, and protection. The dead icon required only reproduction. Her image could now be preserved permanently, frozen at its most desirable stage. No agging, no demands, no resistance. This transformation ensured her immortality, but erased her complexity. Posthumous narratives romanticized her pain. Her suffering became aesthetic. Her vulnerability was framed as part of her charm. This distortion continues to shape how her life is remembered. The myth of the doomed blonde persists because it is profitable and emotionally satisfying. It offers tragedy without accountability. Yet Marilyn Monroe's story is not a cautionary tale about excess. It is a case study in systemic failure, a demonstration of what happens when a human being is reduced to an asset, when emotional needs are ignored in favor of image preservation, when institutions prioritize control over care. Re-hook, and this is the truth most people never confront. Marilyn was not destroyed by fame alone. She was undone by a culture that demanded constant accessibility while denying safety, by an industry that celebrated her desirability while dismissing her distress, by a narrative that punished sensitivity and rewarded silence. Her death marked the end of a life, but not the end of the illusion. The image survived because it was never dependent on her well-being. It was designed to outlive her. Norma Jeane did not vanish when Marilyn Monroe became famous. She remained beneath the surface, absorbing every rejection, every abandonment, every betrayal. Fame did not heal her wounds, it exposed them. In the end, Marilyn Monroe was not a mystery because of how she died. She is a mystery because of how thoroughly her humanity was overlooked while she was alive. And until that reality is acknowledged, the question will remain unanswered. What really happened to Marilyn Monroe?